Let's talk about permaculture techniques I use around my high desert Arizona homestead. Not just experiments, but actual permaculture techniques that I really do use successfully. One of the first things I started to do was to dig swells. And in my case, most of my swells are really more like ditches, but a large part of them are swells, and 100% of them, even if they move water, eventually the water stops flowing and they soak up all that water just like a swell would. So all the way to this gate, all the way to my front gate, there's swells running all the way through the homestead. They are just slightly sloped, so that water moves from the very front of my homestead where the gate is all the way down to this groundwater recharge pit, which will be much larger when I'm done. The water from up top there, that all makes it down. This is the lowest point on my homestead, so that soaks up thousands of gallons of water, and as it fills, the swells continue on down the way. Now this back here, that's a swell alone. It's just a dead end ditch basically, and many of them are kind of a combination of swells and ditches. But as you can see, there's a lot of foliage that grows up along the edges. So this water, even from up there, see there's watermelon growing in there, squash and so on. These lead down into this 4,500 gallon pond, which will fill in about an hour when it rains heavily. You can see all kinds of foliage growing in there, and I haven't watered this in months. So sunflowers and squash and watermelon. Lots of wild goji berries, onions. That was a huge sunflower. And see, there's lots of little goji berry starts and arugula and things like that are springing up around the pond. So swells, by definition, are basically a ditch on level ground, usually just dead end, Just you'll have a ditch that's maybe it's 100 feet long, it fills with water, it soaks water up, and then you can, water stays there for like 6 months at a time, and you can grow things around that you wouldn't normally be able to. Then, if you use a little bit of a slope, you're basically creating ditches. You can lead water and move it around your homestead where you want it. Along the way, see, these ditches, swells, they start at the very front gate and they come all the way down. And I plan to make these demi-lunes about every 20 feet all the way down the driveway. And what happens is that water makes its way down, fills these areas up. I've never watered out here, and you can see little sprouts and stuff coming up inside, and there's cactus around the edge. And these areas will allow me to start growing more goji berry and drought tolerant things like wheat out here where I never water at all. Just from the rainfall, it fills, it holds water for 6 months, and then through the winter it gets wet again, and that'll hold 6 months. And so basically you can pretty well keep the water in the ground all year. And I'll just continue to dig out these ditches / swells. I toss that dirt into the middle of the road. It crowns the road, makes it so the road never gets muddy or sloppy, gives somewhere for the water drainage to go, and eventually that water basically filters itself as it heads all the way down to the pond. If you're curious about my fence, this is the old fence with the electric opener, and I need to move that to my new gate. You can see this bent piece of angle iron here, and what that is I've mounted the gate opener before on a different post and attached it, and it bent that angle iron. So I'm going to remove this angle iron, weld another piece of angle iron to it, and make the structural integrity enough to hold the gate opener so that this bar doesn't bend. I haven't been welding long. I do have a Forney welder. That's how I started. I've got a plasma cutter, and recently I picked up the DP200 from Yes Welder. So here's that old piece of angle iron. It's quite bent, so I'll pull these bolts out and try to straighten it up. Something that makes the DP200 real easy to work, especially for someone who's not highly skilled with welding like me, is it has the 7-inch display, full color, and you have a help button. So we're set up for flux core welding, right? It tells you exactly how to connect everything, so you know exactly what to do there. It has automatic settings, so you don't need to set it if you're unfamiliar. You can choose from meg, mag, flux cord, TIG, stick, and so on. So we're already set here for the wire speed and volt, and you know, if you're really experienced and you know exactly what you're doing, of course you could crank it up a little bit and see what works best for you. But it's very easy, even for a beginner. Definitely the longest solid bead I've ever ran, and all run off of my solar system, a small solar system at that. Demilunes. Demilunes are defined as half-moon shaped crescent pits. They're basically about a foot deep. You can put down some manure and whatnot to help things grow. You know, water runs into them, soaks into them, and they hold water for a long time. Maybe even better than swells do. I had a survey done, so I know my exact perimeter, so it's fenced. Now I have a fence on the interior here that's perfectly straight, and it matches the shape of the exterior fence. That gives me more room to know where I can dig the rest of my, ditches, swells, demilunes, and ponds. And so watching the water sit over time, I know that my lowest point is there. Look at all that foliage. That's where the groundwater recharge pit is. I'll make it as large as possible. I'll even try to add a well to it. We'll see if it works, if I can make my own aquifer. If I can't, that's okay. I've put a lot of water in the ground. There will be a pond over here because that's where water naturally accumulates. You can kind of see how the topography rolls and would allow for that to happen. The same happens over here. This is a natural spot where a really good pond can go. So I have a few spaces, several spaces throughout the homestead that'll be good for ponds. This is just a big sloped area, and so I think that I'll dig across this way some large swells. So they'll just be dead end swells. They don't lead water anywhere. They'll just take that water, hold it, and you can see the foliage growing out here, even though the horses graze. Eventually I'm going to partition this huge pasture off into 3 spaces, and I'll rotate the horses every 4 months. So that'll allow me to grow foliage for them as well. So water accumulates, fills the swells, trickles down, fills the ponds, trickles down. I can put another pond in here. You know, they get into the swell, that water, any overflow ends up filling my pond. And then there's an overflow that goes outside into a livestock waterer, and then any extra would continue to drain on out into the desert as if I wasn't here. What a lot of people don't know from tuning into my channel, they'll say, gosh, why don't you try to green the desert? And it just takes time. I've done an actual pretty phenomenal job growing a couple greenhouses and gardens, even though I only use about 400 gallons of water each week. And so what I'm trying to do is recreate what I've got going on in the greenhouses and move that further and further out onto the homestead. And I'll give you an example of what I mean. So you kind of saw part of the garden over here where there's a lot of squash and watermelon and potatoes and all kinds of things outside growing. And what I've started to do is cover the ground in manure. And actually this entire fenced garden is covered in manure. And so I'm starting to move outside of the fenced area. And I'm starting to cover these gardenous areas by hugelkulturs and the pond. I even grow on top of the root cellar. So this whole area will just slowly, inside the fence, get covered in manure. And eventually I'll push out onto the pasture and do the same thing out there. So not only have I done quite well outside, I've done really well inside. And that's because I can regulate a lot more that way. The soil in here was the first soil I built up. It's very nutrient dense, and you know, looks like there's basil, and there's some onions and alfalfa, tomato plants, beans. This is Swiss chard here. I think that might be kale. Lots of different beans, alfalfa, tomatoes. So as you can see, potatoes and all kinds of stuff are coming up in here. And I just have to recreate this similar kind of environment outside to the best of my ability. Part of that will be using more native plants outside, and that's why I currently have about 30 goji berry bushes growing. As I mentioned, goji berry, wheat, arugula, these things do pretty phenomenal with very little water, and so I'm going to push those things out onto the homestead. Here's a bunch more pumpkin. Pumpkin and squash do good. I've got more hugelkulturs. This is my geothermal greenhouse, and I dug this with a $4 shovel. The second half I was lucky enough to get a guy to help me dig it out with a tractor, but you know, there's a mulberry tree, there's a bunch of different pumpkin and tomatoes and potatoes and carrots and all kinds of stuff in here. So there's 200 linear feet of 4-inch corrugated tubing 3 feet underground in the geothermal, which is also not only a geothermal but a sunken greenhouse. It's 6 feet to the ground, and then the tubing is 3 feet underground. And just with a PC fan, I can keep it about 15 degrees cooler in the summer and 15 degrees warmer in the winter. A large part of having a good garden is having good compost, and so all this stuff breaks down, makes real good compost. I've got a lot of it, and that's why I'm able to continually push it out further onto the homestead. So mulch is really important for gardens and the ground out there, and regenerative agriculture. You put down mulch, it holds moisture into the ground, it has nutrients in it, and mulch will keep your roots warm when it's really cold, and they'll keep them cool when it's really hot. Permaculture is just about using the land to the best of your ability, helping it do what it would do naturally, you know, creating food forests, greening the desert, terraforming Mars. Permaculture is simply using nature and helping it help you, you know, redirecting water, keeping the water in the ground, building up the soil, building up nutrient density, building up the ability for your land to hold and store water and to maintain that water so that you can grow things. And you start growing with bushes and different drought tolerant things that grow easily, and that helps fortify your soil and build a canopy so you can start to plant roots and trees and more and more and more, and push out what you're doing in your greenhouse, you know, push it out onto the homestead.